Studios.
Imagine you're standing at the edge of something. Not a cliff exactly, but close enough that you can feel it. That kind of feeling that doesn't come from how high you are, but how far away you've gotten. And here in Appalachia, that distance isn't always measured in miles. Behind you is a world that's mostly forgotten you're even there. Ahead of you is a wilderness that doesn't care one way or the other if you make it through. And right there in the middle of it, it's just you. A handful of neighbors, a few hundred acres of rough hillside, a rifle you know how to use, and that slow realization that starts to settle in. Nobody's coming to help you. No letters from the Capitol. No real roads. No real judge. No real courthouse. No one standing between you and whatever may come out in the dark. Just you, these mountains, and eventually a question starts to come up. Why are we waiting on permission from people who don't even know our names? And once that question is asked, it will start to gain traction. Because here in these mountains, not long after this country first got its footing, with the Revolutionary War starting to wind down, there were people who decided that they were done waiting. They weren't asking anymore. They were going to build something of their own government, their own future. And for a while, they did, and came closer to being successful than most anybody remembers. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. And if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. This episode came into existence because of someone I work with. I hadn't heard this story until a few weeks ago, and when he shared it with me, I was intrigued, to say the least. Once again, I was bumfuzzled. How did I never hear this story? I briefly shared it with a teacher friend of mine. He wasn't familiar with it either. So, it was right then and there I knew. You all had to hear it too. And soon after he mentioned it to me, places and names I'd heard all my life never knew their origin came to light. The aha moment, if you will. And when I started researching it, it went deeper than I could ever imagined. I found some places that are still in existence today tied to this very story. So in my fashion, you know what I did. I went to those places to get an understanding and feel for this story. And what I learned was another realization. That the history we have here in these mountains continues to amaze me, and I hope it does you as well. So let's get into the story, and let me set the scene for you, because with this story, the geography matters just as much as anything else. It's the 1780s. The Revolutionary War has just ended, or close enough that most people still haven't stopped looking over their shoulder. The colonies are now states, trying to hold things together under the Articles of Confederation, which really just means they've agreed to be neighbors without agreeing on much else. The federal government is broke. The states are arguing, and this whole idea of a united country, it's still more hope than a reality. And out here, beyond the mountains, past the Blue Ridge, past the Holston, past the Clinch, and past the Powell Rivers, down in these hollers and valleys that most of those men back east had never seen, and never would, are people living a life that had almost nothing to do with any of that. And if you're from around here, now when I say Washington County, Virginia in the 1780s, you've got to let go whatever picture you have in your head of that today, because this wasn't something you could drive across in under 45 minutes. This was big. Washington County back then covered most of present-day southwestern Virginia. And why do I say southwestern Virginia instead of southwest Virginia? Well, because in all my travels, when I tell people I'm from southwest Virginia, they think I say southwest Virginia, like the mountain state, our neighbor. So, I, like the ones in this story, thought we could come up with another name for our region. But in the meanwhile, I'll try to say southwestern Virginia to keep down on the confusion. Anyways, Washington County covered part of Smith County, just south of Royal Oak, or present-day Marion, Virginia, along with the counties of Russell, Tazewell, Scott, Lee, Wise, Dickinson, Buchanan, and even parts of what's now southern West Virginia. All of that, one county, and about the same size of present-day state of Connecticut. Think about that. That's most of what we call Southwest Virginia, all under one name. And every bit of it separated from Richmond by hundreds of miles of some of the most hardest terrain you'll find anywhere in the eastern United States. The Great Valley Road ran through here, what people would later call the Wilderness Road, cutting its way through gaps and ridges, but even that wasn't something you took carelessly. If you were heading to Richmond, the newly relocated capital of Virginia, it was over 300 miles away and a hard 10-day journey on horseback. So you packed for it. You made arrangements. You said your goodbyes because you knew you may not make it back. And everybody knew it. The ridges around here stacked up like walls. You had the Clinch Mountain, Holston Mountain, Iron Mountain, one after another, each one standing there like a reminder that the people drawing lines on maps in Richmond had probably never stood in the shadow of any of them, in a place where the hollers flood in the spring and freeze hard in the winter. And everything about this place reminds you you're on your own. A letter from Richmond, delivered by post riders, might take weeks to get here, and if you sent something back, you might not hear anything for months, or never at all. You want to talk about forgotten? The folks living here had a degree in it. So, who were the people living out here in these rough, rural mountains? They were farmers, mostly just trying to get by. They grew what they ate and ate what they could grow. Corn mostly. Cattle and hogs up on the ridges. Gardens anywhere the ground would cooperate. Some years you had enough, some years you didn't. Either way, you figured it out. A lot of them were veterans, too. Men who had left these mountains to fight in the revolution for the idea of self-governments, then came back home and realized the idea didn't stretch this far west. There's a certain frustration in that, fighting for something, then finding out it wasn't meant for you. But more than anything, they were self-reliant. If something needed to be done, you did it, or you got your neighbors and handled it together, because nobody else was coming. That wasn't bitterness. That was just the truth about the place they lived in. And after a while, you don't have much patience for people from somewhere else trying to tell you what to do. Because the people in this part of Appalachia had more in common with the folks across the mountains in what we now call East Tennessee than they did with the men running things in Richmond or back in North Carolina. But back in the 1780s, Tennessee didn't exist yet. What we now call East Tennessee was actually part of North Carolina, the far western edge of it. North Carolina stretched from the coast all the way across the mountains to the Mississippi River, into what people simply called the western North Carolina frontier. So in these two areas, you had the same type of land, same problems, same way of life. The mountains didn't recognize those boundaries, and the truth is, the people living here didn't much either. Now at the center of this story are two men, and you need to know them. The first one is Arthur Campbell, and if you're from southwestern Virginia, that's a name you ought to recognize, or at least the last name. Campbell was Washington County, Virginia through and through. He was captured by a band of Indians as a teenager while guarding a fort near Stanton, Virginia, and held captive for 2 years before escaping. And that kind of thing does one of two things to you. It either breaks you or it makes you stronger. And with Campbell, it made him stronger. More certain, he became a soldier, a surveyor, a landowner, a militia colonel. And by the 1780s, he was one of the men out here people actually listened to, serving as the Colonel Commandant of Washington County and the Justice of the Peace. And he had come to a pretty clear conclusion. The people in these mountains needed a government that actually understood them, not someone sitting in Richmond, looking at them like a source of land revenue and available soldiers. They needed something closer, something shaped by this very place. What Campbell had in mind was bigger than most people realize. A unified Appalachian state, stretching from southwest Virginia through eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, not based on colonial lines, but based on the way people actually lived out here. The second man we need to know about is John Sevier, and his story starts just across the mountains. Sevier was born in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, but he didn't stay there. He moved south, made his life out here the same way Campbell did, by working the land, learning it, and figuring it out the hard way. By the 1780s, he was already known. He'd led the Over Mountain men at Kings Mountain in 1780, a place where men from these mountains in East Tennessee, southwest Virginia, came down off the ridges and fought the British on their own terms. And they won, and it made Sevier someone people trusted, not because of a title, but because he had stood with them, and he understood them, same as Campbell did. He understood what life was like out here, the frustration, the distance, the feeling of being remembered only when it was time to collect taxes or for calling men to fight. And then, in 1784, things started to change. North Carolina, buried in debt after the Revolution, decided to hand its western lands over to the federal government to help pay off its war debt. And for the people living out here, that left them in a strange place. Not really part of North Carolina anymore, but not part of anything else either. No clear authority, no real structure, no one close enough to step in and take control. They weren't North Carolina anymore, but they weren't anything else either. No government claiming them, no courts, no real authority at all. And the federal government, they didn't want it either, and it was in no shape to reach this far into the backcountry. So, in August of 1784, delegates from the North Carolina counties of Greene, Sullivan, Spencer, which is now Hawkins, Washington counties, which included Carter, came together in Jonesboro, North Carolina, now Tennessee, about an hour and a half down the road from where I'm sitting right now. And they did what mountain people have always done. When nobody else shows up, they handled it themselves. They declared their independence from the state of North Carolina with a vote of 28-15. And they started building a new state, with its first recognized capital being Jonesboro. Now, I am intentionally going to withhold the name of this newly created state until the end of this episode, just to keep you in suspense. Now, back in Virginia, Arthur Campbell, who had been communicating with John Sevier about the idea of a new Appalachian state and expressing his desires for Washington County to join this new venture, was leading the way and garnering support for their involvement. He began building connections with others who were starting to see the same thing, people tied to the movement that was forming just across the mountains, people who believed that a new state out here might not only be possible, but necessary. And for Campbell, this wasn't just about what was happening in North Carolina. It was about what it could mean for the people living right here in Washington County, Virginia. Because from where he stood, the new southwestern state could offer something they weren't getting from Virginia, a legislator that actually understood the realities of this region, and protection that matched the dangers people were facing, especially living along a frontier where conflict was constant. So he began pushing for Washington County to be transferred out of Virginia into what was becoming a new state. And for a moment, things in southwestern Virginia appeared to be going in the right direction for this new venture. Well, that was until news made its way to the capital in Richmond. And when the governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry, heard what was happening, he reacted immediately. He saw it for what it could become. Not just one county stepping away, but the possibility of losing a much larger part of Virginia if other counties wanted to join in the movement. So he sent a man on the 10-day journey to deal with it. And the man was someone Campbell knew all too well. His name was William Russell, and this just wasn't political. It was personal, because Russell wasn't a stranger passing through. He had been a colleague, a rival, someone Campbell had stood alongside and competed against for years in Washington County. And the connection between the two ran even deeper than that. Russell had married into the same family. His wife was Governor Patrick Henry's sister, the sister that was the widow of Brigadier General William Campbell, a man who had been both Campbell's cousin and brother-in-law. And even at that time, there were disputes between them over the guardianship of William Campbell's children. So, when Russell arrived carrying out orders from Richmond, he probably did so with a little bit of arrogance about him. And in June of 1785, at a meeting of the Washington County Court, those orders were carried out. Campbell was stripped of his political appointed positions, removed from the authority in the very place where he had built his life. And at the same time, Virginia had made its position unmistakably clear, because Patrick Henry had pushed through legislation that defined this kind of separatist activity as treason. And so, Arthur Campbell was charged with treason, showing how serious Virginia saw this threat. And there's another layer to that, because this was the same Patrick Henry, the one remembered for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." And now he was looking at the same idea from the other side of it. From the people's standpoint, this wasn't rebellion. It was people trying to shape something that fit their lives. But just like that, the hopes and dreams of Washington County, now all of southwestern Virginia, becoming part of a new state, had come to an end. With the charges of treason brought against Arthur Campbell, someone with that stature and influence, an example had been made. And any remaining talks among the people were whispered as tales of what might have been. And back in Tennessee, in March of 1785, the first General Assembly of the new state was taking place, and they unanimously elected John Sevier as governor. What Sevier stepped into at that moment was something that only existed because people believed it did. The new state now had a constitution. They had a legislature, courts, elections, defined counties. They even sent a representative, William Koch, to the United States Congress in New York to ask to be recognized as a state on May 16, 1785. Under the Articles of Confederation, it took 9 states to approve a new state. Well, Koch got 7. 7 out of 9. 2 short. That's how close this came. 2 votes, and we'd be talking about this place a whole lot differently. After the failure of that, later in the year, they even tried getting Benjamin Franklin involved as sort of a helpful influence to become a recognized state by the federal government. Franklin was abroad in Europe and wrote back saying basically that he didn't know enough about it to have an opinion, and he advised them to work out a solution with the North Carolina government. So things didn't exactly move forward at the federal level. But everything they did out here, they did without money, because there wasn't any. Taxes weren't paid in cash. They were paid in whatever people had. Deer hides, beaver pelts, otter skins, tobacco, beeswax. 6 deer hides might cover your county tax. A government official might get paid in raccoon skins. And when it was all said and done, even the governor himself was paid in deer skins. 1,000 of them, to be exact. That's what running a state nobody recognized was worth in these mountains in the 1780s. And up to this point, it might sound like the only question was whether the new state could convince the outside world it was real. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what was happening inside it, because they were 2 governments operating in the same place at the same time. And sooner or later, it was going to come to a head. And spearheading the opposition was a man named John Tipton. And if Sevier is the man most people remember from this story, Tipton is the one standing right across from him. Not a villain, but not on his side either. Tipton was a veteran, a landowner, known in the community. He was there in the beginning, at that first meeting in 1784, and when it came time to vote on the Constitution, he had voted no. That 28-15 vote, well, Tipton was one of the 15 no's. While his neighbors were building a new government around him, Tipton threw his support behind North Carolina, took a commission as a militia colonel, got elected to the North Carolina Senate, and he made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. He stood in the middle of Sevier's new state and dared anyone to tell him he wasn't a North Carolina man through and through. And why was he standing behind North Carolina? Well, they had rescinded their offer of giving their western lands to the federal government, and they had brought it back under their control. After the convention meeting in 1785, where the capital of the new state was set as Greenville, Tipton and Sevier got in a scuffle in the streets. Sevier began striking Tipton over the head with a cane, while Tipton retaliated with his fist, just before the fight was broken up. By 1787, things had gotten strange and tense because now you had 2 governments trying to operate in the same place, 2 court systems, 2 set of officials, 2 claims to the authority, and both of them needed records to function, so they started taking them from each other. Tipton would ride into Jonesboro and take the new state's court records, and then Sevier and his men would go to the North Carolina side and take their records right back and forth, and all of it happening in towns where everybody knew each other, where families were split right down the middle. In addition to the records battle, Tipton, now serving on the North Carolina legislature, began doing what he could to undermine Sevier and his new state with his political influence. He tried to move courts around, tried to move the county seat from Jonesboro, creating new counties to take away from Sevier's state. And at one point, Sevier and his men got fed up with Tipton, declared him the cause of their problems, and Tipton didn't back down. There was even a rumor at one point that Tipton had captured Sevier and hauled him off in chains. And when word spread, about 200 armed men showed up at Tipton's place ready for a fight. Well, it turned out it wasn't true, but the fact that the 200 men moved that fast tells you everything you need to know about what's going on in that part of the country. By 1788, things were starting to come apart. 4 years of this had worn people down. Support was slipping. And then there was the Cherokee situation. Sevier and his state had made their own treaty. The federal government had made a different one. And suddenly, the land people were living on was being handed back. Sevier couldn't enforce anything. Didn't have the power. And North Carolina, watching all of this, decided it was time for it to come to an end. In early 1788, a court order came down that Sevier's property was to be seized, taxes owed to North Carolina. And a sheriff named Jonathan Pugh showed up and took several of Sevier's enslaved people and handed them over to John Tipton at his house. Now, you can probably imagine how that went over. Kind of like a lead balloon, no doubt. So Sevier gathered his militia, marched out of Greenville, and headed straight to Tipton's home in present-day Johnson City. February 27th, 1788, he had arrived, and for 3 days they surrounded that house. A standoff, and then a small skirmish ensued, and then it turned into something else. Gunfire. Then there were casualties. Some men were killed, several wounded, and Sevier's forces, after the arrival of the North Carolina militia, began pulling back. On March 1st, 1788, Sevier's term as governor ended. No one replaced him, and just like that, the state that had been built without permission started to disappear. But not before other acts of desperation. Sevier tried to get Spain to join them in an alliance. Once word got out that Sevier had been talking to another country, support from even his own loyalists began to diminish. And when the governor of North Carolina was informed of Sevier's talks of a potential alliance with another country, he issued a warrant for his arrest on the charge of treason. And just when you thought it was over, what happened next is one of those moments that feels almost too Appalachian to make up. By this point, John Sevier was a man without a state. No office, no real authority, and warrants out for his arrest. In October of 1788, he walks into a general store in Jonesboro looking for whiskey and rum and tells the owner to give him some. The owner tells him he doesn't have any. Words were exchanged, somewhat of a brief argument. Sevier draws his pistols, and one of them goes off, wounding one of his own men. The store owner runs to Tipton. Tipton gathers a small group, and they spend the night hunting Sevier through the countryside. By morning, they track him to a house, but Sevier slips out the back, but not fast enough. He was spotted in the yard and taken into custody. He was thrown in jail in Jonesboro that night, put in irons the next morning, and sent to Morganton to stand trial for treason. But he never made it to trial. His people showed up. Family, friends, men who had followed him before. They walked into town and broke him out of jail. And ironically, the sheriff didn't give chase, didn't send anyone after them, didn't even try, because that sheriff had stood beside Sevier at Kings Mountain and regarded him as a war hero, and whatever the law said, he wasn't going to be the one who put the man back in chains. That's not written law. That's something else. That's mountain law. And if you've lived here long enough, you know the difference. By 1789, it was over. John Sevier and his followers took an oath of allegiance to North Carolina in a Greene County court. Sevier, the same man who had led a state that wasn't recognized, was elected to the North Carolina Senate. A few years later, Tennessee becomes a state, led by the actions of Sevier himself, who would then become its first governor. So in essence, Sevier did get his wish for a new state. Arthur Campbell's charges of treason were dropped, and he continued his political journey by serving the people of Virginia. And John Tipton, the man who fought against it all, ends up living in the same new state too, the one built on top of things he tried to stop. History has a way of doing that. Over the years, 2 additional attempts were made to form this new state, one by Andrew Johnson in the 1840s, the same Andrew Johnson who would become later Vice President of the United States, and then assumed the presidency after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Then again in 1961 by U.S. Congressman James Quillen. Attempting to create the 51st state, the measure passed the House but died in the Senate. But many believe this was just an attempt to bring attention to the history of the lost state. So, what was the name of this 14th state? The 14th state that never was. The original 14th state. The lost state it has been called. Well, it originally was called Frankland, which has a historically interpreted meaning as land of the free, from the Old English Anglo-Norman word frank, meaning free. And when Sevier was struggling with becoming recognized as a state and was seeking backing from Ben Franklin, well, they voted to change the name to Franklin, honoring Benjamin Franklin himself. And so, in 1784, they became known as the state of Franklin, and remembered locally as the lost state of Franklin. Now, if you're from around these parts, it will start making sense to you. If you've ever traveled to Johnson City, Tennessee, you've probably driven on the State of Franklin Road and never given it any thought. And by now, you're starting to recall businesses, banks, healthcare companies, and even a hospital that's included the State of Franklin in their names. The idea behind it, that question, never really went away. Who decides what becomes a place? Is it the people living there, or the ones drawing lines somewhere far away? And if you've ever lived in a place like this, you already know that question doesn't stay in the past. It follows you. It settles into the land, just like everything else out here, because in Appalachia, you always have both. You have the roots, which is the lands, the families, the people who build something for themselves, whether anyone notices it or not. And then you have the shadows, the disagreements, the lines that get drawn anyway, the things that almost were, but never quite made it. And sometimes, the things that didn't happen tell you just as much as the ones that did. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.